Hey folks, Mike here, your host for the Security Silverback. In this segment, we're going to take a look at Bad Security Practices document recently released by the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency and the FBI. As I'm releasing this in late October 2024, the document is still in its request for comment stage with the Federal Register. It will remain there in December 26, 2024, so if you've got the experience and knowledge to weigh in, I encourage you to do so. I've included links to both the Product Security Bad Security Practices document and the request for comments below. Now, before we get started, do me a solid, and if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button so you can see these when they first come out. And like and comment after the video would be useful as well, since the feedback is really helpful as I get the series spooled up. Now, on to the CISA FBI Security Bad Practices Guidance, which grew out of CISA's Secure by Design initiative, which I've also linked below. At its heart, the Bad Practices document is a review of things not to do when you're developing a product, which is the perfect counterpoint to the usual do it this way guidance we normally get. While you'd think that a best practices document is all you'd ever need, we all know they're not always followed, and some products manage to follow the best practices and still hit production with serious security flaws. For their document, CISA broke down the bad practices into 3 separate categories. Quoting directly from the document, we have product properties, security features, and organizational processes. CISA breaks down each of these main categories into smaller chunks, of course, and each chunk describes the issue and what you can do to deal with it. Now, I'm not going to dive too deep into each one, but I want to gloss over the main points and, more importantly, what you should be doing instead. So first up in product properties bad practices is developing in-memory unsafe languages. We all know that not all development languages are created equal when it comes to inherent security, with some of them being particularly bad. CISA's solution to the issue is multi-part, starting with using a memory-safe language to develop your products in the first place. But for existing products that were written in something that was unsafe in the first place, they recommend developing a memory safety roadmap that shows how you're going to address existing issues and make the code more resilient against memory problems. They're suggesting having the roadmap published by the 1st of January 2026. Second up, including user-provided input in SQL queries. It actually surprises me that they need to include this, since we've been told never to allow raw SQL inputs for ever. There's even an XKCD strip about it. Their recommendation, though, is straightforward, amounting to using the input sanitization and parameters query techniques we've been using for a couple of decades now. Third point is allowing user-defined input and operating system command strings. Again, this is something we've been told not to do for decades. CISA's specific advice is to make sure the user input is clearly separated from the command itself. Fourth, and a personal favorite of mine, is including default passwords in a product. They include shared passwords in this as well. The funny or maybe sad thing about this is when I was getting my GCIH over 20 years ago, I used default password vulnerability in the breach scenario we had to create as one of the questions. I referenced an actual default password in an actual piece of kit that one of the major ISPs was distributing at the time for DSL connections. Kind of hard to imagine that CISA still needs to say, this is bad, don't do it, over 20 years later. They included a nice list of suggestions, which I'm popping up now. Fortunately, most of these are already broadly implemented. In fact, I couldn't use the same default password attack in my GCIH essay now because all the kit I've seen recently ships with randomized passwords. The reference to phishing-resistant multi-factor authentication is significant, and I'm planning to do a video on the topic myself in the near future. 5 and 6 are closely related and deal with including known exploitable vulnerabilities in the production code. 5 only references CISA's KEV catalog, which I'm going to assume means they're talking about commercially licensed modules or libraries or other components. 6 is essentially the same thing, but references open source libraries specifically. The recommendations are slightly different between the two, though in truth I think that the overall patch and disclose advice from 5 applies in both cases, while most of the advice specific to 6 I believe applies to 5 as well. I'm not going to post the full list of suggestions here, but I am going to highlight the ones I firmly believe apply to both. I truncated the list up there, but most of the things they recommend for open source projects can apply equally to commercial libraries as well. The software bill of materials one is something I don't think gets enough attention, to be honest. It's like an ingredients list for your product. And yes, there may be times you don't want to reveal what goes into the secret sauce. But there's also the problem of getting sued when you didn't mention the peanuts and someone goes into anaphylactic shock. or whatever the product software equivalent would be. The document's second major section goes into the security features and only includes 2 points. The first being a lack of multi-factor authentication, which we mentioned already earlier. Though here the recommendation talks about making sure the product supports MFA natively if it handles its own authentication, or it incorporates an external identity provider like single sign-on if it doesn't. In any case, they strongly recommend requiring MFA for any administrator login. Their second point in this section is not including a way to gather evidence of intrusions. To paraphrase, they're including things you should be logging anyway for security reason: config changes, user accounts, and data access, at least in broad strokes. And the recommendation is straightforward. Basically, log the important stuff, and if you're a cloud service, not only log it, but retain it for at least 6 months. Now, something I don't see them talking about in this document, and I would certainly include, is never reviewing those logs. Seriously, how many people have processes in place to regularly review their logs? Even if you're just doing a script to parse the logs for anomalies, let alone some AI-enabled log reviewer, too many organizations gather the logs and then just let them sit until they age out, or even without a basic review. Do better. Finally, we get to organizational process and policies, and again, there's just 2 components to this one. The first is failing to publish vulnerabilities to the CVE list, including the corresponding CWA or Common Weakness Enumeration. And the second is failing to publish a vulnerability disclosure policy. The first one is simple. If you find something vulnerable in your product, admit it, publish the CVE, include whatever mitigation you can, fix the problem while hoping the mitigation reduces the impact until you can finally fix it, and finally release the patch. Yes, there is the risk of publishing the CVE may give threat actors the clues they need to create an exploit. It happens, so the risk is real. But in general, I believe that transparency is worth the risk. To be sure, there's some case-by-case risk measurement going on, and that's what the entire concept of coordinated vulnerability disclosure addresses. But again, I lean towards transparency. Especially if the impact's not critical, there are mitigating measures that can reduce the potential impact, and any evidence shows the threat actors are aware of the issue, or worse, already exploiting it. The final point involves not publishing a vulnerability disclosure policy. While I agree, I think the even more relevant bad practice is not having a vulnerability disclosure policy in the first place, let alone an unpublished one. Along with publishing the policy, CISA has some solid recommendations on what the policy should include. The recommendations here are important, especially considering the history some companies have had recently of actively going after researchers who find and report exploits. But summing up, we have: let people beat on your product to find vulnerabilities, give them a clear way to report the problems, work with them to coordinate publication. Don't threaten them with legal action if they do. And finally, but most important, fix the problem. So there you have it. A relatively brief summary of the CISA and FBI's Product Security Bad Practices document. I encourage you to read the whole thing, and if you're inclined to follow through with any comments you have on it. While they're in the business of coming up with guidelines, it's cybersecurity practitioners who are living it, and they're the ones who know what actually works in practice, and what doesn't. That's it for this time. I'd appreciate any feedback in the comments, and as always, hit that subscribe button and give a like. Both are a huge help as we get the channel up and running.